The Afghan government and Taliban talk with the hopes of ending decades of war. Both sides are under pressure to hammer out a deal, but is a quick resolution to a long conflict even possible? And what would it take for the insurgents to lay down their weapons? I'm Ali Aslan, and today's Newsmaker is the intra-Afghan peace talks. Even as negotiations take place in the Qatari capital of Doha, the bloodshed in Afghanistan continues. According to the UN, the levels of violence in the last 5 weeks are the highest Afghanistan has seen in the last 5 years. On the table in Doha are dozens of contentious issues, including the rights of women, the terms of a permanent ceasefire, and even the possible renaming of the country. If the talks are successful, it will be the first time in generations that words and not weapons will help form the makeup of Afghanistan's future government. But with division and distrust so entrenched, is finding mutual ground even possible? And how far are both sides willing to go to give peace a chance? Tierney Bonini reports.
It's the issue of realizing that war is not a solution, fighting is not a solution. Let's get together and find a peaceful way towards the future.
The words of Abdullah, one of Afghanistan's leading politicians, at last week's peace talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban. This is the first time the two warring sides sit face to face. The talks are the result of a landmark deal signed by the US and the Taliban earlier this year. Under the agreement, the US committed to pulling out its forces by mid-next year if the Taliban stops allowing militant groups like Al-Qaeda to attack the US and its allies in Afghanistan. The deal also outlined how the Afghan government would release 5,000 Taliban prisoners in exchange for 1,000 members of the Afghan forces. Fast forward 6 months, and in August this year, 400 Taliban fighters accused of major crimes were released. One of them was Baz Mohammed, a kidnapper who spent 8 years in prison.
I call on my leaders and the president who ordered our release and call on them to embrace a permanent ceasefire and stop the bloodshed so that we all have peaceful lives. The lives of our youth have been miserable due to war.
But militants are still carrying out attacks. On the eve of the peace talks, the Taliban attacked civilians and security checkpoints in 18 of the country's 34 provinces. The UN estimates the Taliban has killed more than 1,500 civilians since striking the deal with the US back in February. The most urgent agreement is a permanent ceasefire. Other issues in discussion are social equality, women's rights, and details of power sharing. Speaking at the opening of the peace talks, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said a peace deal would be challenging but benefit future generations.
I hope you will look inside your hearts. Each of you carry a great responsibility. But know that you're not alone. The entire world wants you to succeed and is counting on you succeeding.
This is Fazia Koufi, a trailblazer, a former member of parliament, and one of 4 women at the negotiating table with the Taliban. Last month, she survived an assassination attempt. The Taliban have denied they were behind the attack, but the US Embassy in Kabul has warned extremist groups are targeting women. Things weren't supposed to be like this. The US invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 was billed in part as a fight for the rights and dignity of women. The Taliban ruled Afghanistan for 5 years. Under the strict interpretation of Islamic law, women were banned from working and going to school. But after the US toppled the Taliban, some progress. 3 million girls returned to school. Now, with peace talks in the making and the Taliban pushing for its form of government, some fear the fragile progress made in women's rights could be sacrificed. One thing is for sure, against a backdrop of violence, moving forward will be difficult. So, can these intra-Afghan talks put an end to nearly 2 decades of war? Tierney Bonini, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I am joined now from Doha by Habiba Sarabi. She's a member of the Afghan government's peace negotiation team. From Kabul, we have Bilal Sarwary, a journalist specializing in Afghan affairs. And from Washington, D.C. is Jamille Bigio. She is a senior fellow in the Women and Foreign Policy program at the Council on Foreign Relations. Habiba, your country certainly has seen its fair share of bloodshed, 40 years of conflict and turmoil. How hopeful are you? How optimistic are you that this now might be a turning point for your country?
Good evening. Good evening to you, Ali Aslan, and all the panelists and the friends that they are present here. For the Afghan talks, Afghan peace talks, of course, we came here, or the negotiator, for hope that all the insurgents put their weapon down, and we can talk. And the political solution is only solution that we have to come over on that. So this is that's why we came with hope. But of course, at the same time, we have to be cautious about that, because the Taliban mindset is still something that we cannot expect that everything can be resolved very quickly and very soon. So the talk will be very tough, and it's not easy. It's like a bumpy road, but we do have the hope and also the strength to sit and talk.
There's certainly much more work to be done for a sustainable peace solution, Habiba, but you are part of the negotiations that take place right now in Doha. Under which atmosphere, under which, if you will, sustainable atmosphere are these conversations taking place? Could you give us some updates, some inside information here?
If I can elaborate a little bit the condition or the situation or the atmosphere that you talk about that, I feel or I found the atmosphere a little bit better because this is the third time that I'm facing in talking or sitting together with Taliban. The first time it was in Moscow, the second time last Doha dialogue. So this time they are much more calm and polite and talking in a nice atmosphere. I hope that this cannot be a kind of show or surface. But of course, from the other side, if we can go deeply, we will understand what will be, the real mindset of the Taliban. But I hope that it will be a political willing for that to sit together and resolve the problem with talking.
So the talks are taking place in a professional and courteous atmosphere, says Habiba Sarabi. Jamille, what do you make of these talks? As I said, this country, your country, Afghanistan, has gone through a lot in the past 4 decades. Is this the turning point that all Afghanis have been hoping for, or is it too soon to celebrate and even speak of a peace deal?
Well, we certainly all hope that these negotiations are going to result in a political solution and will lay the groundwork for the country to recover and move forward in its future. And one question, you raised the fact that women's rights are among the list of contentious issues being negotiated now. And many Afghan women fear that in this mix that their rights will be traded for a chance at ending the conflict. And one thing that I would note from the research that we are doing, looking at the importance of women's participation and of gender equality around the world, that this, in fact, would be a counterproductive choice to have an agreement that sells out the rights and opportunities of half the population. And that's one of the central questions amongst the debate on a ceasefire and power sharing arrangements. Will Afghan women's rights be protected? Will they have an opportunity to participate fully in the future of their country? And one thing that the research shows is that when women do have a seat at the table, when their rights are protected, that countries are more prosperous and stable. And to the contrary, when women's rights are denied, as could happen in Afghanistan, as hopefully will not happen, but could, that countries experience greater instability, corruption, and conflict. So, in fact, questions of where Afghan women's rights will fall in this agreement are central to the question of, will the agreement be sustainable and will it lead to a brighter future for Afghanistan?
For sure. Women's rights, certainly one of the central issues. And Habiba's presence in Doha, she was the first female governor of an Afghan province, certainly is a very good sign, at least a hopeful sign that things might turn in favor of women's rights. Bilal, let's look at the deal. Obviously, this all started with the US-Taliban deal back in February, and one of the conditions were the talks that are now taking place in Doha. Of course, Taliban had to enter the talks with a government that it had been considering and regarding as illegitimate since day one. Many Afghan officials and even some high senior U.S. officials, such as the former U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan, Ryan Croker, say the deal gave the Taliban way too much without assurances in return. Would you concur?
I think definitely the U.S. withdrawal deal where the Taliban left the Afghan National Security Forces in an extremely vulnerable situation. For example, over the last 48 hours, we have seen a devastating wave of attacks, truck bombs, attacks against smaller Afghan national security bases in remote parts of Afghanistan, and then obviously airstrikes from the government side. So every single day, every single morning, coffins are going back to smaller villages and valleys and districts on all sides. And the only business that's thriving today in Afghanistan is coffin-making factories have opened up. The people of Afghanistan really will not be the winners of these meetings, as hopeful as they might sound, until and unless there's not a ceasefire. And we understand that we often hear from Western officials, especially from American officials, really making it look like it's a success story. It might be for the American administration, for example, with the U.S. elections coming close. But for Afghanistan, it is a very, very difficult and painful road. There's a lot of uncertainty. For example, what happens to the rights of women, what happens to girls' education, what happens, for example, to music and musicians in the Afghan media. And I think that's what the people of Afghanistan are demanding, a comprehensive ceasefire, because every single coffin falls like a thunder on a family, on a valley, on a village, on a city in Afghanistan. And every single day, Afghans continue to basically receive dead bodies. So the cost is too much, simply.
Absolutely. High cost indeed. And Habiba, you said that the talks in Doha take place in a professional and courteous environment. But as Bilal, of course, pointed out correctly, the attacks on the part of the Taliban still continue. Actually, they have increased since the US-Taliban accord back in February. Now, that doesn't sound like an organization that is fully committed to peace, doesn't it? I mean, the biggest sticking issue here is to overcome the mutual distrust, and these attacks, I would reckon, do nothing for it.
That's true. Unfortunately, after the agreement between US and Taliban, the violence has increased. So this is something that that's why the people of Afghanistan wants ceasefire. And so if we can avoid bloodshed in Afghanistan, only to avoid the killing of one person, it will be a positive sign. So this is unfortunately when the peace talk in every country and every peace agreement and every peace process, when the peace process can be started, so this violence will be increased. This is something that they wanted to have upper hand for the deal, but which is the wrong sign. It's not, I mean, from humanitarian point of view, from the human being, how to demolish all the life of the people. It is something that we have to think like a little bit on the human being side or humanitarian side, rather than to have to kill the people or increase the violence to have the upper hand.
Jamille, let's look at the role of the United States here for a second, and Donald Trump, of course, in particular. He is, of course, eager to present a peace deal before the November election, something and fulfill an election promise, if you will, in the process. Now, Taliban, of course, has agreed not to let terrorist groups use the Afghan territory as a haven to launch attacks from, and the U.S. in return would withdraw most of its soldiers. Donald Trump, of course, is very eager to end America's longest-running war, but do you think he's doing it so particularly and specifically with the upcoming election in mind? Do you think a bit more care would be in order here?
I do think it's critical that, first of all, the U.S. ensures that the Taliban is keeping to the terms laid out in the US-Taliban deal. Many criticize that deal, as we spoke already, as being too generous, too lax on what it required of the Taliban. But even those requirements, there are questions of whether the Taliban is actually meeting them. And the U.S. government has not stuck strongly to the terms and has not signaled that it would slow the withdrawal of U.S. forces. In fact, it has sent some mixed messages, but has signaled that it will continue to proceed in withdrawing U.S. forces, which was one of the Taliban's primary demands in its negotiations with the U.S. government. And it's a piece, as you said, that President Trump is quite conscious of in terms of the electorate, of whether he is fulfilling his promise of removing U.S. troops without regard to what that withdrawal will mean to Afghanistan's future. And that's a piece that we do want to see the U.S. government pay closer attention to, of ensuring that any withdrawal of U.S. forces is done in a way that facilitates the negotiation, that facilitates a smoother political solution for Afghanistan, and in the end, peaceful recovery for the government, for the country.
And Bilal, as we said, and Jamille also pointed this out again, how can the U.S. hold the Taliban accountable if the deal fails? Again, many people have said way too many assurances have been given to the Taliban in return for the deal with. So a lot of people are quite critical about the role of the Taliban and the U.S.'s strength, if you will, to hammer out a deal that will be satisfactory to all sides. What's your take?
Well, remember, there's very little transparency when it comes to these talks between the Americans and the Taliban. The Afghan government obviously was not part of it. Now that there's delegation and people like Minister Sarabi who are representing the aspirations of generations of Afghans, especially after 2001, are also probably struggling with this part of the problem. The Afghan people simply cannot afford any backdoor deals, because you have to look back to the history of this country to understand the present. The West has abandoned this place once in the 90s. The international community at the time, the Americans did not commit to a process. So those risks are real. What happens, for example, from now on? Do Afghanistan continue to get $4.5 billion US to keep the country's security institutions? What is the fate of Do they want to join the Afghan National Security Forces? What happens to, what happens to the issue of high unemployment? What happens to the issue of revenge and justice? I look at a difficult road, and you would probably not hear that from the American officials publicly, because that would not make President Trump look very successful. But this shouldn't be a deal in a hurry, because the risks are all over the place. It's written. And Afghanistan, unfortunately, very tragically, could go back to very, very chaotic days. Remember, there is a state today in Afghanistan. No one really denies that there are issues on this side with the government. But we have also had a situation when Afghanistan didn't have a state in the 1990s. So what happens to 200,000 Afghans who have weapons there in the Afghan National Security Forces if they don't get, for example, funding in the next year or two? So there are a lot of issues. And I would also say that the daily cost, the hourly cost of this conflict is simply too much. The people of Afghanistan on all sides, be it the Talib, the soldier, the civilian, pay a price. And war has really crippled my country. I mean, a few days ago, there was a wedding party.
Right.
And even the bride was wounded, 19 members of one family. So everyday life is extremely fraught, and you probably need a very big program to clear the roadside bombs in Afghanistan. I mean, you're looking at huge challenges ahead.
Absolutely. I think it's painfully evident and clear how fragile the current construct is while searching for a peace deal, of course. Habiba, I think we all agree that a future without the Taliban in Afghanistan is unrealistic. What is the best case scenario that Afghan officials, that the Afghan government can reach in Doha?
That's true. Totally agree with that, that the future of Afghanistan without Taliban, without any, not only Taliban, the peace deal should be very inclusive. When I'm talking about inclusivity, it's include women, minority, different religion in Afghanistan. So everybody should see themselves in the future of Afghanistan. So that's why it's very important to think about all the factor that it will help the sustainable and just justice in the future of Afghanistan. So anyone who lives in Afghanistan, they will be a part of the society. We have to talk about that. This is something that we have to talk at the table of the negotiation, that what do we want for the future of Afghanistan? And on this case, we can talk and we can take this the positive part, or the common sense and the common point, and after that talk about that and to reach some sort of agreement.
Jamille, is a lasting peace agreement with the Taliban possible?
It is, if the Taliban commits to a ceasefire, if it commits to protecting women's rights, if it commits to being true partners in the future of Afghanistan. Because we know that a lasting agreement cannot be reached if they continue to use violence to advance their political goals. We know a lasting agreement cannot be reached if Afghan women's rights are sold out, if half the population does not have an opportunity to participate in the political, economic, social life of the country, then the agreement will be unstable. The country will be more likely to be affected by conflict and corruption and instability if women's rights aren't protected. And we know that if the Taliban and the Afghan government cannot agree on an effective power sharing arrangement, then the risks are high that they will break the political solution and return to violence again.
Habiba, just quickly, since we're running out of time, because Bilal has said this should not be a rush deal. And of course, we already talked about how mindful Donald Trump is of reaching a peace deal, ideally before November 3rd. how you are in part of these delegations. Realistically, how long do you think these talks will take place until a deal can be reached?
For all the peace process, unfortunately, something which is not predictable is the time. The timing, we cannot say that how long. Of course, this is something, but we have to share some limitation or to talk about with both sides for the limitation of the time, that we cannot stay forever here in Doha. But the other thing that we shouldn't sacrifice the quality for the speedity. Right. So this is the other side. So to take both sides, we have to agree for a limitation of time. But I cannot tell you what clearly what time will be.
Absolutely. After 40 years of bloodshed, peace should and ought not to be rushed in a country where peace has been quite elusive for some time. Habiba Sarabi, Jamille Bigio, and Bilal Sarwary, thank you so much for your participation, your insights, and of course we will continue to monitor and watch this story. Thank you out there for watching, and hope to see you again next time for a new edition of Newsmakers.